All the time, people tell me that the First World War lacked innovation. That in particular, the general staffs refused to adapt their plans and their preconceived notions to the novel situation which they faced. That they lacked imagination and were only capable of throwing endless waves of flesh into the grinder for 4 straight years. In short, the old trope of the lions being led by donkeys. But the reality of the war was so much more complex than that. In fact, the Western Front, which is what I'm mainly going to be speaking about today, was an, I would argue, exceptionally innovative field of conflict by practically every measure. And in this video, I'm going to go through just a selection of the countless extraordinary examples thereof. But first, before we do, I think it's important that we understand what we mean when we use the word innovation in a military context. So what is innovation? How does technology function in warfare? Well, it isn't just a slider to adjust or a bar to fill. It's definitely not a tech tree wherein one element just follows after another in a long, spidery line with different branches being separate from one another. In reality, the concept of innovation consists of 1.5 million different factors, both scientific and cultural, that all play off of one another simultaneously, feeding off of and building each other up. It's weapons and medical technology. It's battlefield logistics doctrine and domestic industrial policy. It's everything from a slightly improved way to dig a latrine trench to a new kind of tank. Now sometimes these innovations are big, they're extraordinary, they're famous, they're world-changing and whatnot. And other times they're only minute, they're little changes that alter a fraction of a part of a larger whole. But still, it's innovation, and it's vital to that whole whether we see it or not. After all, to invent the modern-day tank with a 360-degree turret, you first need to invent the ball bearing. And you, of course, need to make sure that the guy who's going to be operating that tank isn't stuck back at camp with dysentery because someone didn't dig the latrine ditch according to the new regulations, as boring as that particular kind of innovation may be to read about, right? In short, innovation is a science, right? And sometimes science can be dull, right? It's technical, it's numeric, it's dry. And yet, when you look through all of that, there's also a distinct kind of art, a beauty, I think, to be found even in those most minute of details. And it's to be found in the way that all those details come together to create something else entirely new. Within every science, there is also an art. And you know what's an amazing way to better understand and appreciate that dynamic? Well, conveniently, it's actually through this video's sponsor. This is The Book, the ultimate guide to rebuilding a civilization. It's an absolutely gorgeous, and if you couldn't tell, massive, hand-illustrated encyclopedia of all sorts of different stumbly there, all sorts of different inventions and discoveries, with the main conceit being that if civilization falls apart, this is what you're going to need to rebuild it all from scratch. The artwork inside is absolutely beautiful, and it ranges from more technical engineering type pieces to more fantastical medieval and steampunky kinds of artwork. It's all very steampunky. In fact, if you enjoy that kind of thing, then you're gonna love everything that this book has to offer. Now incidentally, it's also exactly the kind of thing that I'm sure military theorists throughout history would have loved to have, because throughout the 400 plus pages, its 180 different topics include military technology, from flintlocks and bows and arrows to tanks, as well as agriculture, railways, steamships, medical tools. I mean, you name it, it's probably in here. It's also a really high quality book, as you can see. They've printed it all on this lovely matte paper, which feels really good when you flip through it, and it has a sort of aged texture you can make out there. That sort of just helps to add a little bit of austereness to the whole project, right? I found it's pretty fun to just sort of flip through the thing at a whim every once in a while, go to a random page and, oh, look, today I'm going to read a little bit about looms and sewing machines. Learn a couple of fun facts about how it all works and, the technology that goes into these, sort of everyday simple things that we may not otherwise think about, and then, of course, admiring the beautiful artwork along the way. It's a fun, it's an engaging way to explore a very wide range of different topics. Again, everything from, like, civilian technologies to, they have rubber here, for goodness sakes. Everything you can imagine, they've got a section on it. Now, the book itself has already propelled itself into being a bestseller, and it's raised over $3.2 million on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. It's a lovely gift idea to boot as well. So if you'd like to check out the book for yourself, you can follow my link in the description down below, and of course be sure to use code BRANTONF10 when you order your copy. Thank you so much to Hungry Minds, creators of the book, for sponsoring this video and reminding us that alongside being important, innovation can also be beautiful. Back to the topic at hand. Of course, we're not here to discuss beauty, at least not in its traditional sense. We are here to discuss the First World War, a conflict which raged over 4 years, and most notorious for its stalemate on the Western Front, where indeed, at first glance, it might seem that both sides of the struggle were simply running into each other over and over again, resulting in countless casualties for mere meters of ground. Yet in reality, while yes, there was a stalemate, it wasn't for any lack of innovation, for a lack of adaptation or imagination, be that on the part of the generals or anyone else. And to demonstrate my point, we're going to look at just a few of the countless examples of innovation, again, primarily on the Western Front, keeping in mind what we said earlier about how this stuff works and how every moving part is contributing something to a wider effort. So hold on to your hats, because there's going to be a lot of information here, and we're going to go pretty quickly. One of the most iconic developments of the war was, of course, the steel helmet, introduced to the average European soldier, rather than just specialized troops like heavy cavalry, for the first time in hundreds of years, and with new and, dare I say, innovative designs to not only protect the men against shrapnel and falling debris, but also to be light, easy to handle, and of course, capable of being produced en masse. There were also specialized helmets for roles such as tankists and sappers. There were even experiments with full-scale body armor to protect soldiers, although these trials were typically found wanting and as such not embraced at scale. Many powers also experimented with various types of camouflage and portable cover. Now, many of these, like the whole fake dead horse or fake tree to cover up snipers and the like, didn't quite take over the military world, but other developments like camo nets certainly did, as did canvas and burlap covers or special paints for helmets, all used to break up their shapes and ensure they weren't too shiny to reveal their location to the enemy. But of course, what use is a soldier protected if that same soldier is not capable of action? To that end, small arms and individual infantry weapons saw massive developments throughout the war. It saw the first applications of light machine guns, capable of being carried by small teams of soldiers for immediate infantry support, rather than just relying on the heavier fixed pieces that were always used as more static defenses. Another piece of older technology that came to the forefront in a new way was the grenade, with new bombardier drills alongside new grenade types like the Mills bomb being developed to allow small teams of riflemen and grenade throwers to operate in tandem while clearing trenches. The technique of firing grenades from rifles, with things like the specialized rifle grenade cup, likewise wasn't entirely new to the war, but was certainly far developed throughout it. Another great, if particularly brutal, way to clear trenches that was developed during the war was the infamous Flammenwerfer. What did it do? Well, of course, it werft Flammen, much to the chagrin of any upon its receiving end, and particularly when it first saw use as an entirely new, entirely frightening technology. For those men who preferred to get up close and personal, there were a wide range of tools soon adapted, more so than developed, and employed for trench raiding, wherein men would cut down to the bare minimums of equipment and cover or blacken their faces to remain hidden in the dark before sneaking into enemy lines, not only with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools, which, incidentally, those e-tools were also a pretty innovative design, allowing every soldier to have one on their person at all times, but also things like trench clubs and even, occasionally, brass knuckles. So, again, not necessarily the most technologically sophisticated approach, but still an adaptive new style of warfare that soon became eminently popular for its brutal effects. But so far, everything that I've discussed here has been individual. What about the way in which these infantrymen, so novelly equipped, were actually being employed? Well, contrary to popular belief, this also saw a dramatic number of changes and evolutions throughout the war. At the very start, infantry assaults were taking place at a large scale, with entire battalions, or at least whole companies, moving as single large blocks under the command of singular officers. Now, that's a very big generalization, I understand, but in very broad terms, the start of the war did see large columns of troops all moving at once. But by the end of the war, we see small units, companies, but also platoons, perhaps even individual squads, all operating under the command of much more junior officers. Not a major or a captain, but a lieutenant, a second lieutenant, even sometimes independently operating NCOs. The entire course of the war, then, was more or less an affair of learning how to effectively coordinate increasingly large numbers of men at an ever-shrinking level. Nor were these infantry reforms limited to the scale and command structures of their formations, but also the way in which those formations were spaced, the timing of their assaults, even the intention of those assaults, what they were meant to do and reasonably expected to achieve in this new era of warfare. We go from expecting an offensive to achieve a grand breakthrough of the enemy's line, as they had always aimed in the past, to the development of bite-and-hold tactics, or most iconically, to the invention of modern-day infiltration tactics, largely through the use of the German stormtroopers. And new tactical doctrine wasn't limited to the infantry either. Men like Field Marshal Haig oversaw the introduction and development of combined arms warfare, with these smaller-scale units operating directly in tandem with armor, artillery, and air elements. All of that as well, mostly without the use of radio. A lot of it was being done by runners and telegraph wire. Now, when people hear Haig, they think outdated cavalry commander. But likewise, the cavalry shifted their own overall approach to fighting in some pretty big ways throughout the war, not just being available to exploit any potential gaps in the enemy lines, as had always been the case with cavalry, but also coming to represent rapid response forces that were armed in a myriad of ways, from their traditional sabers and lances to rifles and machine guns, and many other means besides. If you're interested in learning more about the specifics there and how, in particular, the British Empire cavalry were being employed on the Western Front, well, I have a pretty significantly lengthed video on that topic already, which I'll link down below. And in those efforts, the cavalry were likewise joined by other elements that weren't quite new, again, but they were certainly being employed in very new ways. These included armored cars and, of course, bicycle troops. Of course, the tank itself deserves some attention here as well, being, after all, one of the most innovative tools really in all of military history. It was born directly out of trench warfare as a means for heavy support to be directly moved over top of deep trenches and over thick meshes of wire. Now, the first tanks were mechanical monstrosities, slowly crawling their way across no man's land, breaking down all the time, and brimming with machine guns and artillery pieces and very large crews. But they were soon diversified into all kinds of different models, including most notably the French light Renault tank, which was the very first to introduce a turret capable of rotating a full circle intended to support infantry at speed. And the creation of each of these machines required extraordinary investment and research, as well as production time and resources, all of which might just as easily have been applied to more traditional means of warfare had these technologies not been readily embraced. Now, from the offensive, we can look to the defensive, and trench warfare itself, which, despite its reputation of stalemate, also necessitated a wide variety of innovations. Now, some of those innovations were small, like the periscope rifle, or how, on the British webbing systems, a little series of straps were soon added onto the left side ammunition pouches to prevent their popping open when men would stand along the firing lines, usually with their left side, as such, pressed against the trench wall. Of course, other developments were much more significant, like how machine guns and new light mortars would be integrated within the lines, exactly where they would be positioned to have the best effect and whatnot, as well as the actual system of designing and constructing the trenches themselves, which soon evolved into highly complicated, sprawling defensive networks with various lines all supporting each other and designed to limit individually the impact of trench raids and artillery fire, while still being capable of being reinforced at a moment's notice from all the others should a section fall. And speaking of artillery, its doctrine was also continually evolving throughout the war. For example, through the development and perfection of various different kinds of fire, including creeping barrages and box barrages. But the way that the guns were firing wasn't the only new development that they had in response to trench warfare. The various armies also experimented with new types of shells, like gas shells, or reaching the zenith of shrapnel shells, as well as with different sizes of shells, and all of course being fired at a scale never before even comprehended by the militaries of Europe. They would also mix together all of these different types and sizes of shells to try and figure out what combinations and proportions and timings would ensure the greatest possible effect upon the enemy. Which in turn brings us to gas warfare, another entirely new and particularly dismal system of war. There were multiple different kinds of gas employed by the armies of the Western Front, including mustard, chlorine, and phosphine gas. And some of the more notable early uses of gas saw it being deployed by opening up canisters nearby one's own trenches when the wind was favorable and allowing it to drift over to the other side. That obviously had some drawbacks, however. And even in the earliest days of the war, work was being done to put the various kinds of gas into artillery and mortar shells, even into grenades. And to counter that new kind of gas warfare, entirely new technologies had to be developed on the defensive side. First, there were pH hoods and simple masks that would be soaked in neutralizing chemicals. But those soon evolved into full-on gas masks as we know them today, including the large and small box respirators, and the German Lederschutzmaske, which, once again, you can see how clearly has influenced modern-day gas mask design. Perhaps the most significant of all these novel forms of warfare was aerial warfare, which was again born directly out of the First World War and upended nearly every convention of military doctrine in existence to that point. But you know what? Don't just take my word for it. I think that there is an Animu PNG file that is far more qualified to talk about the dramatic shifts which we saw in aerial warfare during the First World War.
Aerial warfare. Well, that's something we take for granted these days. One wouldn't think of combat in modern times without some form of air assets in play. However, at the beginning of World War I, such ideas were seen as experimental at best. In a mere 4 years, we went from planes being used as simple scouting platforms to 150-mile-an-hour gun platforms. Initially, scouting planes were unarmed, save for an observer packing a camera. Opposing pilots would leave one another to their own devices, but by late 1914, we started to see the first recorded engagements involving pistols. I happened to cover that in my Battle of Tsingtao video, actually. Pistols evolved into carbines, and carbines evolved into machine guns on flexible mounts. 1915 saw the introduction of the interrupter gear, which was a mechanism that allowed a machine gun to fire through an aircraft propeller without damaging it. The first true fighting aeroplanes began to tangle in the clouds, and each engagement brought with it lessons for this new kind of warrior. German ace Oswald Bohlke penned his first set of rules for dogfighting in 1915, many of which are still taught to fighter pilots today. It wasn't just the fighter aircraft that saw a drastic evolution either. Bombers saw their debut in the Great War as well. Faster and less vulnerable than Zeppelins, the late war heavy bombers like the German Gotha or the British Handley Page Type O were able to carry almost a ton of bombs behind enemy lines to deliver with, well, mixed levels of precision, but the idea was definitely there. I could go on for hours about other innovations like the first parachutes, incendiary bullets being used for Zeppelin attacks, and even early radios applied to observation balloons, but my point is simple. If you think there was no attempt at innovation during the Great War, well, I'm surprised you're able to pass high school, you
Okay there, Falcon. I think they get the picture. Falcon's Fighter Tales, ladies and gentlemen. I'll link some of his stuff down below if you'd like to follow his work. You gotta be careful with the flyboys. Anyways, new medical techniques, technologies, and organizational practices also needed to be applied, treating not just shrapnel or gas attacks, but disorders that were both physical and mental, the notorious shell shock. The First World War finally had the beginnings, after thousands of years, of acknowledging what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. The war also saw the first large-scale use of medical triage methods by the British Army. It saw the mass application of X-ray technology at the front, no less, in mobile ambulance units. Even the concept of a blood bank itself has its origins in the First World War. The scale of brutality also revolutionized facial reconstruction surgeries and the use of prosthetic limbs, to say nothing of the countless smaller developments in everything from treating trench foot and burns to much more significant injuries. Just as there was significant work then being put into evolving the world of combat doctrines and military technology, well then so too were medical fields and even civil society at large embracing change and adapting to the situations before them. Another particularly noteworthy example of the civil society side of things would be the role of women, and how so many women from every social class found themselves stepping into military and industrial roles, all of which were hardly cushy positions, including enlisting with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, aiding the Army as drivers and mechanics, as well as nurses and cooks, and in more administrative roles. By the end of the war, there was even a Women's Royal Air Force, likewise to serve primarily as mechanics on the new fighting aircraft. So, when we say that there was no innovation, no adaptation, no imagination in the First World War, what exactly are we talking about? Because it certainly wasn't in battlefield tactics, certainly wasn't in military technology, or in logistical measures, or even the evolution of civil society, or really anything else that I can think of. What I can think of, though, are a whole slew of other fields that saw extraordinary innovation and change over the course of the war that I didn't mention at all here. Naval developments, the use of animals in the war, communications technology, different kinds of railway, the 1.5 million other different forms of infantry assault techniques that were employed. There's so much. All of these changes took place more or less over a 4-year time span. Now, the Second World War, in comparison, was a 6-year conflict, and of course it too saw massive innovations. But when we get down to it, looking at the way that, that war was fought in 1945 and comparing it to 1939, is there really that much of a difference there than there was between 1918 and 1914? Now, the pace of change usually increases over time, I know that, but proportionally speaking, can we really say that the Second War was that much more innovative, that much more varied and revolutionary than the first one was? Now, I admit I know more about the material means of the latter than of the former, but honestly, it does strike me that the Great War might actually be the more innovative of the two, the more revolutionary in the number of changes that it saw, all things considered. I mean, again, when we say that there was no innovation in the war, what are we referring to? Is it that day 3 of the Somme looked a little bit too much like day 1? That warfare itself didn't completely revolutionize overnight? Well, when we look at the First World War, and especially the stalemate of the Western Front, which found itself in so unique and disastrous a set of circumstances, both material and technological, for at least a good portion of not even the whole war, just a good portion of it, well, when we look at that situation, right, we do so oftentimes through popular media and generalized cultural understandings. We look at the most iconic portions of any given event. In this case, the muddy trenches, the frontal assault, the enormous loss of life. And when you mix those common cultural themes, right, with the more nuanced and complex origins of the war, to say nothing of the whole, that general all war is inherently evil mentality that came about in the 60s and contributed so heavily to the lions led by donkeys narrative, well, with all of that, right, it's very easy to see where these broad generalizations come from, that there was no innovation during the war. But they are just that, generalizations, and gross ones at that. They're a small bullet point version of a war that, yes, was marked by stalemate, but not for a lack of innovation, as I said before. It's the sort of history that's taught to students who just need to tick off the correct box on a multiple choice quiz that was in turn given by teachers who are forced to cover the history of the world from 1815 up to 1914, 1918, whatever, in a single unit. It's just not correct, right, on any level beyond the shallowest of surfaces. The First World War was an extraordinarily innovative conflict in almost every regard, from the way the soldiers were operating individually to how they were being cared for and supplied, of course, the way that they were actually fighting at scale, and everything else in between and beyond. Every individual year of the war looked different from every other year. Now, sometimes it only looked a little different. Other times, it looked dramatically different. Something else that I didn't even mention at all in this video, but it's incredibly important to keep in mind through it all, is that even on that narrow little strip of the Western Front, there was no single environment that all of these innovations and different approaches were being tested and applied. The entire Western Front wasn't Passchendaele and the mud and everything. It was rivers and canals. It was woods and forest. It was hills and valleys and flat fields. It saw fighting through ruined cities and abandoned towns, through burnt villages, and over some of the most complicated fortifications then known to mankind. It was fought under the ground, it's another category that I didn't even mention before of innovation, as well as it was fought in the air. And that's all just the Western Front, to say nothing at all of the fighting that took place from the peak of the Alps down to the deserts of Mesopotamia. And so we cannot just look at a single time and a single place and then generalize an entire war effort based off of it. It simply doesn't make any sense to do so. And again, contrary to popular belief, the First World War really was a highly innovative conflict in so many different regards, whether we're looking at individual soldiers or entire military structures. It's just that for so many different reasons, it was also a particularly brutal conflict. But to write off all of those myriad complicated reasons, which were technological and geographic and political and economic and also, yes, social and cultural and whatnot, but to write all of that off as just, incompetent, uncaring generals smoking their cigars behind the lines, thinking they're oh so brave, pinning a medal on their chest and thinking of all the ways they can kill off all the proles. To do that is not only, of course, an intense disservice to the history of the military itself, to the history of the war itself, but it's an intense disservice, I think, to all of the other history which rests upon the shoulders of the First World War, i.e., the entire history of our modern world. Now, my name is Brandon Fischella, and on behalf of the Native Oak, thank you all for watching. Remember, of course, to visit nativeoak.org to learn more, including to read a whole slew of primary sources on these topics that I've discussed today and many others from our free digital library. You can also learn more there about our charity fundraising efforts, and please do feel free to visit because this video was rather difficult for me to get through. I had to record it 3 times, and each time there was a problem with the microphone, and I finally figured it out. So, 3rd time's a charm. It's not a short one to record through. But anyway, so I went through all that. Go check out the website and read a little bit. Make it worthwhile. Make it worth my time. Thank you so much. And of course, I am, and even through technological difficulties, I shall remain, my dear viewer, your most humble and obedient of servants. Today's viewer artwork comes from Nicholas, who actually sends us 2 pieces to enjoy. The first being a striking pencil sketch, which he aptly titles A Dead Hussar's Stare. It's a rather creepy looking one. And the second, a Lego composition of some chaos, titled Close Ranks. You can see these pieces and plenty more, as always, via his social media on Instagram, which I will link down below. And finally, welcome to the Native Oak's newest patron, John, who by virtue of his support has made this video and all of my work possible. As always, you can learn more about that work by visiting nativeoak.org.